Resisting an invader is one thing. Taking back territory, another. Is Ukraine armed and ready for its long-touted spring counteroffensive? We'll ask about air cover, cross-border strikes, ammunition. More broadly, what does it take to claim heavily fortified, heavily mined Russian-held positions? Is Kyiv ready? Is NATO ready? Will stepped-up supplies of military hardware suffice? Will weigh the consequences of a protracted war should it continue on the alliance. Russia shows no signs of slowing down its degrading of Ukraine's stockpiles with daily strikes on major urban areas, including Kyiv and, for instance, the recently retaken frontline city of Kherson. How do Ukrainians arm themselves physically and mentally for all that still lies ahead? Today in the France 24 debate, we're asking if the counteroffensive's already begun. With us, she's just back from the eastern and southern fronts there. France 24 senior correspondent Catherine Norris-Trent, thanks for joining us.
You're welcome, Francois.
From Kyiv, Ukrainian Member of Parliament Inna Sovsun, welcome back to the show.
Thank you for having me again.
From Warsaw, Maria Zolkina, Director of Regional Security and Conflict Studies at the Democratic Initiatives Foundation and researcher at the London School of Economics. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
And thanks as well to from London, British former military intelligence officer Philip Ingram. Welcome back.
Good evening.
The France 24 debate, where you can join the conversation you have on Facebook and Twitter, hashtag F24debate. Yeah, more than 900 kilometers of front line, plenty of places to pick information war battles, and real fights. The week beginning with Moscow's claim of a thwarted Ukrainian offensive on the eastern city of Donetsk, one that's been shrugged off by Kyiv. Gavin Lee has more.
This grainy drone footage, released by Russia's defense ministry overnight, is, it claims, the start of Ukraine's counteroffensive in eastern Donetsk. The smoke you can see in the fields, said to be Ukrainian tank divisions being destroyed. And this, the moment of a direct strike. An operation from 5 separate fronts that failed, says Moscow, publishing this statement claiming victory.
The enemy did not achieve its tasks. It had no success. As a result of capable and calculated actions of the groups of forces in the east, the Ukrainian army suffered losses of more than 250 people, 16 tanks, 3 armoured personnel carriers, and 21 armoured vehicles.
There's been no comment from Kyiv. But plans love silence was the message from Ukraine's defense ministry in this video, published on social media on Sunday, warning speculation could help the enemy. Hours before that, President Zelensky told a newspaper his country is now ready to recapture territory occupied by Russia. He said he's constantly meeting NATO allies, demanding more weapons and air defences, adding they couldn't wait for months. In recent weeks, Russia has found itself defending its own territory with multiple attacks here in Belgorod, a key border region for supply lines. 2 Russian paramilitary groups supporting Ukraine claim responsibility for the attacks on energy installations and fuel depots, amongst other targets. Analysts describe these attacks as Ukraine shaping operations, trying to create the conditions on the battlefield and beyond that gives the best chance of winning on the ground. Whether the counteroffensive has started or is about to may not be clear for some time.
I guess we need to define, I'll begin with you, Maria Zolkina. What is a counteroffensive and has it started?
Good evening. First of all, I'd like your team to make it visible for me, the studio, because now I don't see you, just hear you. And speaking about counteroffensive, I'm not sure that we are already in the active phase of a counteroffensive, but we're definitely in the preparatory stage, which includes not only specific attacks on different parts of the front line, but also precision-guided targeting of military bases, of stockpiles, of storages of Russian armor deep in occupied territories of Ukraine. And that strategy has been going for several weeks already.
And when you have, as the foreign minister stated to the Reuters news agency in the past hours, quote, enough weapons to start the counteroffensive, what's your reaction to that?
It means that at least major part of what was promised to Ukraine has finally arrived, with some kind of delays because it was supposed to arrive at least in April. But I think the question is not only about the arrival of enough quantity of weapons, but also of finalizing all the trainings which dozens of thousands of Ukrainian soldiers were passing through in our partner states.
We heard there Philip Ingram from Maria saying that the active phase hasn't yet begun. Every day, though, we're scanning for news from the front line. The Ukrainians claiming gains, for instance, around the reclaimed southern city of Kherson. The Russians, in turn, by the way, responding with daily shelling. Your thoughts on movement on the battlefield?
Well, the counteroffensive, the main ground push is the bit that everyone's focusing on, and that hasn't started quite at the moment. But a counteroffensive is a very complex operation, and there's a number of phases to it. And as we heard, the first phase has been going on now for a number of weeks, and that's preparing the battle space. That's the incursions that there have been into Russia, the drones that have suddenly appeared over Moscow, the probing along the front line, the attacks with long-range missiles into the rear of the Russian areas, destroying command and control areas, the derailing of trains, the destroying of logistic sites, the mysterious fires that seem to be happening in oil refineries and all the rest of it in Russia and in other occupied territories. So that's the preparation phase. It seems as if we're in a transition at the moment into the next bit, which is reconnaissance along that massive front line that you talked about, probing different areas to confirm the plans that the Ukrainian military have got for their major ground offensive, confirm that they've identified the proper weak points, and to keep the Russians dislocated so that they don't quite know where the main thrusts are going to come in, and therefore they can't concentrate their defenders and they can't concentrate their reserve forces in a position to be able to stop that. And that's where we seem to be transitioning to over the last 24 hours.
24 hours, you're saying? So this is happening fast.
Well, it's we've started to get the reports through of this change, of more going forward, and looking at the pictures that are being posted out on social media from the Russian side in particular, because the Ukrainian side is being very good with its operational security, but the Russians are showing pictures of US wheeled vehicles. There's been pictures of AMX-10 tanks coming in. Those are the sorts of vehicles that I'd expect the Ukrainians to be using in a forward reconnaissance force, going in and aggressively trying to probe the Russian defenses, to find those weaknesses, to confirm the intelligence that they've got on them, to make the Russians think that an attack is going in different places, whilst the main body of the attack, which could be going into more than one place, is still preparing, finalizing what it needs to do, and getting ready to go in coming days or maximum coming weeks.
Sitting in the capital, Kyiv, Ina Sovsun, are you getting a sense that over the last 24 to 48 hours, we are entering some kind of a new phase?
Well, things are definitely happening, things that we have not seen before, because indeed for the last couple of weeks, we were seeing that there was some initiative taken by the Ukrainian army, the drone attacks, explosions, unexpected explosions in Russia, warehouses with ammunition. Within the last 36 hours, news coming out from the front line are very different. We are seeing that indeed Ukrainian army is trying to probe in very different directions. What we are seeing is people moving in different direction, and we are getting news from different directions, be it from the south of Ukraine or on the east around Bakhmut, around Donetsk. That is where things are happening. And I think at this point it's way too early to say where the main counteroffensive will concentrate, because I think that as of right now, Ukrainian army is just trying to see where that would be doable. As of right now, the main kind of direction of the counteroffensive is still unclear, and it's still unclear for Russians, which is good. It's unclear for us, but it's also unclear for Russians. So I think that is a good sign, because the more confused they are, the less clear it is for them where Ukrainians are moving into, the less prepared they will be.
And what's the reaction of people around you to that public service announcement campaign by the government showing soldiers with their saying "shush, don't be silent about what's going on"?
Well, there was an ongoing joke here in Ukraine. Is the first rule of counteroffensive is we don't talk about counteroffensive, and I think that is something that people did learn. And I think the reason why it is so easy for people to understand is because with almost 1 million people being in one way or another involved in the army, around 300,000 who are directly in the front line, many people have their loved ones, have their relatives, have their friends over there in the front line. And we all, including myself, my partner is in the front line. And when we all, everybody who has friends or relatives or loved ones there, we all understand that keeping silent about this is something that is important for literally the survival of the people that we know and love who are there on the front line right now. So for us, it's very personal for everybody. Everybody has someone who is there, and people are just trying to make sure that we don't do harm by speaking too much. So, and another element here is that there is a very high level of trust in the military command, and there is an understanding that they know better. They have done miracles so far. They have managed to save Ukraine when nobody believed that it is doable. So I think that we hope that they will manage to be successful right now, and we just have to trust their judgment.
Catherine, you were on the front lines, both in the south and in the east of Ukraine. You're just back. What's startling watching your reporting is a lot of the soldiers you spoke to quite blunt about how they were feeling and experiencing it all.
Well, this has been, it's been 15 months since they've been at war, and a lot of them had not had all the leave that they were told they were entitled to. They've been at full pace, so we were split with one unit, and there were no rotations away from the front line for them, so they were just living in the trenches. Others said they'd had 10 days leave in the past 15 months, so that they're tired. They've been through some extremely tough battles, and yet there is this determination, which is, really existential for a lot of them, clearly, that they have to push on, they have to fight. And so there's a real mix of emotions there. They know it's not going to be easy in the coming months. They know that the Russians have really fortified these defensive lines. So various people in the east and the south were saying, look, we know there's these lines and lines of trenches. They're very scared of the minefields. They don't think it's going to be like a quick push like we saw in Kherson last September, or in the Kyiv province up in the north, where, things move very fast. They weren't expecting something like that. So perhaps a more complex picture. The conditions have changed since the first year of the war. Russians are using a lot more and using them more successfully reconnaissance drones, so that Ukrainians used to have a slight advantage there. That's now disappeared. Both sides can see exactly what the other's doing. And so it's going to be very deadly. And they know, people, there's no exact casualty figures being disclosed by the Ukrainians, or the Russians for that matter, but they've clearly suffered heavy losses. The men would tell us that, and they're kind of bracing themselves for more. They know it's not going to be easy, and yet there is this determination that's still there. And
show us one of the last reports you filed before returning last week.
Well, this was one report which we filmed on the southern flanks of Bakhmut with a mortar unit from the 28th Brigade of the Ukrainian Army. And they were actually really upbeat, considering that they'd been living in bunkers and trenches for the past 6 months, because they'd been telling us already how they were getting to take back bits of land, 100 metres, 300 metres at a time. And they felt that they had some momentum. And, we asked them the question that everyone's asking everyone in Ukraine about the counteroffensive. And they were like, look, for us, it's already started. It's going to be part of a continuous. So take a look at this report, which we filmed with Yoann Baudin and Dmitry Kovalchuk.
The Ukrainians urgently want to stop any further Russian advance from Bakhmut and have managed to push them back around its outskirts here. These units are deployed at full pelt. All leave away from the front line has been cancelled. The men have been living in bunkers since winter.
We came here in December.
We arrived in the Donbass on the 3rd of December. Next week it'll be 6 months since we've been here.
From their side, they're shelling less. And on our side, we're more experienced. And we have more mortar shells now.
This unit tells us they at last have enough ammunition. Manning the mortar position is Kostyantin, back from military training in the UK.
The drone's still looking for targets, and then we'll correlate the exact position, and then we'll fire. They didn't tell us the location. We were just taken there. It was somewhere near the sea.
Our interview is cut short. This unit now fires up to 50 mortars a day, and it seems to be slowly paying off. They've consolidated a series of small gains in the past month. When we ask about Ukraine's wider counter-offensive, this is the response.
It's already started. Last month we advanced 100 meters, then 300 meters, then further. And it's also like that all along the front line. It won't be quick this time. They won't retreat easily. They came here with lots of equipment and tanks, so you can't push them back easily.
So, little by little, they fight on, reporting that this morning their mortars scored a direct and deadly hit.
We hit a unit of soldiers next to a small bunker. They just started to dig it. We saw them, 2 soldiers digging, a third in the bunker, and maybe some others, I don't know. Let's get out of here. We shouldn't hang around in case they hit us back.
Despite their smiles, danger is never distant on these heavily manned and fortified front lines.
So you see there the kind of determination and the motivation that's still in place. We saw them getting mortars there delivered. They told us from a Ukrainian company that's producing those. And they're now getting ample supplies for the first time, which is honestly in previous reporting tricks, I've just heard people telling me they didn't have enough ammunition. So this is not artillery, but it's interesting to note nonetheless that they had people who'd been trained in NATO countries, and they told us they had enough ammunition, and they were feeling, well, pretty chipper.
Maria Zolkina, your reaction?
I think that ammunition is, as for now, at least for the first part of the counter-offensive, is already solved issue. But Ukrainian side, Ukrainian defense forces and political leadership of the country are interested to make counter-offensive and reclaiming of the territory as fast as possible. Of course, with leaving the costs, especially in terms of human losses, as low as possible. Exactly because for a long run, for a protracted conflict, and for the operation which might last for several years, they will be much more problematic to support the forces on the ground with ammunition, because simply Western economies, despite what Russia blamed them for, didn't prepare for the lasting conflict with anyone. So that's why, as of now, as for the 2023, as for the 2024, the issue is solved, and we have seen pretty positive movements like the common public procurement decision taken by the European Union to support Ukraine, especially precisely for counteroffensive with ammunition. But this is actually a very elegant example how Ukraine is going to use all the military resources on the ground as efficient, as effective as possible, exactly because protracted conflict is not in the interest of Ukraine from any point of view, including possible shortage of ammunition after 2024.
Is it kind of now or never? If there isn't a significant gain during this summer, it's going to be big trouble for Ukraine?
It's not now or never regarding this summer or this autumn, because the counteroffensive cannot be just one large-scale, huge operation which will happen during several weeks. It's just not that kind of price Ukraine will be ready to pay for, because in this case there will be just the Russian tactics of using Ukrainian soldiers as the cannon fodder, which we cannot afford and which we cannot do actually. So I would expect actually that we will see several phases, several operations, which all together will frame the huge restoration of the control over all occupied territories, and they do not necessarily need to be finished within summer or even autumn 2023, but also can last, for instance, within winter next year, winter 2024.
Is that how you see the near future in a soft zone?
Well, it's indeed very difficult to predict because indeed many things will depend on how things will continue to move. But what is clear is one thing, is Ukraine will never agree to some half-hearted solution, a solution where we are forced to make peace while Russians are still controlling any part of our territory. That is not something that we are willing to accept, not after everything that we have suffered. So indeed, I agree with Maria very much, saying that we should not expect, and the West particularly should not expect, that Ukraine will take back all of the occupied territory in one counteroffensive. That is not doable. That will indeed require too many losses, something that we are not ready to do and we will not do. So we have to understand that no matter how big and successful this specific counteroffensive will be, there will be others, and there will be others that we will need and we need to be prepared for. And we need, and I'm saying that because I think there is this big expectation of the counteroffensive with hopes that maybe this will be done by that will be the final counteroffensive. Most likely it will not be the final counteroffensive. Most likely there will be protracted or longer term fight that unfortunately we'll have to be prepared for. Not because we want that, trust me. I don't want that, but something that is realistically we can assess that can happen.
And just tell us, that's your feeling. Do your constituents share those managed expectations that you've spelled out for us?
Well, again, given that majority of Ukrainians have someone on the front line who is fighting right now, their friends, loved ones, neighbors, anyone. It's everyone is very much invested emotionally in this, and the level of the number of people, the percentage of people who are ready to make any compromises is actually decreasing the longer the war goes on. So if at the beginning there were people who probably at the beginning had some pro-Russian sentiments, they would say we just have to make peace. But the longer it goes on, maybe quite unexpectedly, the less people are willing to make compromises. The more people are willing to fight until we win and until we take back control of all of our territory. Despite everybody being tired, exhausted, people in Kyiv, we all have been living through almost nightly, every night, the attacks in the city. Which wake you up. You wake up because of the explosions, because of the air raid alerts. People are extremely exhausted physically because they didn't sleep for a month. But nowhere, no one is stating that we should try to make peace and make them deal with Russia. It actually, the opposite is happening. We are less willing to make any deals after everything that has been happening.
Philip Ingram, in that report that Catherine filed, you heard that one soldier talking about how he's not at all underestimating how the Russians have dug in hard this time, and it's not going to be like the fighting from last year. Can this counteroffensive be a success without full air superiority?
Well, that's a difficult one. In an ideal world, there would be at least local air superiority over where the Ukrainian mainland effort is going into. Now, the Ukrainians can probably generate that. They can do that from their ground-based air defense systems and from what limited Ukrainian Air Force is available if it's concentrated in that one particular place at the times when it's needed. Ideally, you'd have complete air superiority before you launch a counteroffensive, but that is really, really difficult in here. And as has been said beforehand, the counteroffensive there isn't going to be one. It's going to be a number of phases. What Ukraine is doing is trying to eat this massive Russian bear that has come and taken over a huge amount of territory. You can't swallow a bear whole. You have to eat it bite by bite each time. And sometimes you're going to get a particularly chewy bit if the defenses are there. Sometimes it's going to be slightly easier and a bit of a tastier bit. That's what's happening at the moment. Those areas are being probed, and the Ukrainians will start to take nibbles and then bites and then chop more off this Russian bear that's illegally occupying its territory.
And at this point in time, again, it's back to that question of is there enough preparation? We saw in that report that one officer who'd gone to the UK for training and was back. How is it playing out? How has it changed in the past year?
Well, it's more than the past year. The Ukrainians have been sending their staff officers over to Western staff colleges to be trained in the operational art for many years. I went through the first advanced command and staff course at the British Staff College, Joint Staff College, in 1996, and we had our first Ukrainian staff officer on the course with us there, and he became a good friend. So they've been trained in that. The important thing is not just getting the Western equipment into the Ukrainians and training them how to operate that equipment. It's also training them how to fight that equipment, and that's the thing that takes the majority of time. And they've been doing that very successfully. And it's once you've been trained how to operate, how to fight, and how to fight it with different bits of equipment together, that's the time it then deploys into country and is prepared into the formations that are going to carry out this counteroffensive. I think the training is proving very successful. And the one thing that came out of the report that we've just seen is the importance of this moral component of fighting power. And part of that is the motivation behind the troops that are there. And that motivation is from a personal and professional motivation. Are they properly trained? Are they being looked after by their commanders? Are they being fed properly? Are their families being looked after? What is their motivation for being there? And it's protecting their families. It's national survival and personal survival. And then training is an important part of that. Compare that to the Russians, where a lot of the conscripts don't know why they're there. They're not getting properly fed. They're not getting properly supported by their commanders. Their commanders aren't there with them. You've got a competent, capable force with proper motivation attacking a ragtag force that has got this label of being the second best in the world, but in reality, as has been proven, they're not.
The motivation, Catherine Norris-Trent, and at the same time, as Ina Sovsun said, the exhaustion, right? Especially with those relentless bombardments of civilian areas.
Absolutely. I mean, and anywhere you are in Ukraine, you can be hit. So that's part of this psychological war that's being waged on them as well, in that you can be hundreds of kilometres back from the front line and you can die from a bomb in your sleep, basically. For the people in the frontline areas, I mean, there's pretty relentless bombing all the time. A lot of the civilian population has left, but the soldiers, they're living under bombardment every day and every night. So that's become part of their daily reality. The morale is really high. I think this is a really important point that was just raised because, we were on the outskirts of Bakhmut, the city which has virtually just fallen into Russian hands after a 10-month bloody battle. We're perhaps, expecting some more level of demoralization, and we were very surprised when we filmed with these guys and we filmed with other units.
Yeah, so I was going to ask you. You filed an earlier report where they said, we're not at all demoralized. But I was wondering, was that just for the cameras?
No, you could see that they were physically tired. You could see that visibly this had been very hard, and that was with another brigade which had been inside Bakhmut and they'd been holed up underground for long periods of time under intensive shelling. You could see the physical tiredness. But again, and they'd lost a lot of their fellow soldiers. It clearly has paid a toll. And they, obviously they're speaking to the cameras, they're speaking to the international press. But, we spend a bit of time with these guys. And I don't think it is just for the image of it. There is this motivation to keep on going and to try and get some kind of momentum, get it back on their terms and to keep going, which is pretty remarkable. Although, we have seen it in Ukraine since the beginning of this full-scale invasion last February, just the sheer motivation and mobilization of the soldiers and of civil society as well is really something to be reckoned with, as well as all these Western weapons which are coming in.
Yeah, motivation on the one side, defending your land. They've been officially, Ukraine is not involved in those cross-border incursions we've seen in the last couple of weeks. Pro-Kyiv militias of various stripes who claimed new advances over the weekend across the northeast border in Belgorod region. They even claimed to have captured a village there and taken at least 2 Russian soldiers a prisoner. Maria Zolkina, your view on this, because again, it's that question of the Ukrainians know why they're fighting, the Russian soldiers not necessarily. Those cross-border incursions by those militias, does that galvanize the Russians or demoralize them?
I think that's, first of all, a very important point that those incursions are made by people holding Russian passports and who are Russians and who are not consider themselves to be Ukrainians. They consider themselves to be Russians fighting with Putin regime. And on the second hand, very important thing is that I think there is clear evidence that this has demoralizing effect on Russian side, and also military effect on some kind of even partial, at this moment, not as huge, but still some kind of withdrawal of Russian forces, which came out directly after the first incursions, and it was done namely from occupied Ukrainian land in Luhansk region, because the Russians simply realized they had somehow to strengthen their border with Ukraine and bring those some kind of units back to Belgorod region in Russia. But altogether, this is very clear psychological hybrid effect on Russian society, which can bring people to the decision, or probably will bring them to the decision that it is not possible just to hit and to shell Kharkiv or Sumy region just 20-30 kilometers from a Russian border, and at the same time having complete safety for the Russian sovereign territory. But Ukraine itself, of course, doesn't interested in organization of Ukrainian operations on the Russian soil, exactly because we're not interested in Russian territory. We're interested in recapturing the Ukrainian soil.
Yeah, there's, I guess, what's called in military parlance psyops taking place on both sides, Maria Zolkina. There's our correspondent in Kyiv, Gulliver Cragg, reporting that there's been warnings about disinformation coming with videos posted to social media by the Russians. And in the other direction, we don't know if it was a Ukrainian or a Russian who did it, but there was a Vladimir Putin impersonator who called into several radio stations and issued warnings that there was a Ukrainian invasion. That's sowing confusion and panic a little bit. Your thoughts on that, Maria Zolkina, in terms of are civilians on both sides ready for the huge onslaught of disinformation that we're going to see, even more than now, perhaps?
If we speak about that episode on radio, so that was definitely not leadership of the Russian Federation, because they actually doesn't do anything which they must do in case they think this is kind of violation of their territorial, not integrity even, but even unofficial cross of the border, because Russia is a permanent member of the Security Council. And if they were brave politically and courageous politically enough to say about this kind of incursions, to confirm they are happening, they would definitely use the platform of Security Council to say at least something about that. But they choose the side of actually this informational strategy, try to say nothing or confirm just minor things without blaming actually specific units for that. So this is lack of, I would say, not military, but actually political decisiveness to say that, okay, the war might affect the Russian Federation itself.
Ina Sovsun, how far should Ukraine take the fight to Russia?
Well, we don't want to take the fight to Russia. We don't want anything besides our borders. That is extremely important to understand, is that everything Ukrainian army is doing is with one single goal, that is to liberate our territory. Anything that happens within Russia that helps this goal, we can applaud this, but we are definitely not planning to take over Moscow. trust me, we want to be done when we get to our border and establish full control of the border. That is very important to understand. We never were a threat to Russia. We were a victim here, and now we're just doing everything possible to survive and to fight back. And some things that are happening, particularly in Belgorod region, are indeed helping Ukraine to liberate its territories, of course, because that means that Russia now has to relocate some of its personnel, some parts of the ammunition stock, everything to Belgorod, in order to do something about those incursions. So does that help Ukraine? Yes, it does. Does that limit the ability of the Russian army to continue shell my native city of Kharkiv? Yes, it does. Kharkiv is 40 kilometers away from the Russian border. It will always be 40 kilometers away from the Russian border. So the idea of the Russian troops that are making incursions on the Russian territory to claim that they need to establish some sort of demilitarized zone around Ukrainian border is something that is very dear to my heart personally, because it hurts me to think about what Russians have done to Kharkiv. So that does make it easier for us, but it's not our ambition to take over any part of land in Russia. We want them to deal with their own problems by themselves. We just want one goal, and that is to liberate our territory and to punish those who committed violent crimes against humanity here on Ukrainian territory.
When we talk about those different phases in the build-up to this counteroffensive, one of those is hitting supply lines. That's happened inside of Russian territory. At times, Ukraine does not comment on those drones that have sometimes fallen deep inside Russian territory. The U.S. Defense Secretary was asked about this Monday. He's on a trip to India. Lloyd Austin reiterating the official line from the Biden administration.
The use of our equipment for offensive operations in Russia, we certainly would discourage that. And in terms of our ability to track in-use monitoring, we continue to progress in terms of capability. The limitation has been from the very beginning the number of people we actually have on the ground there in Ukraine.
Who's he talking about, Philip Ingram, the number of people we actually have on the ground in Ukraine?
Well, there's the U.S. diplomatic capabilities still in Kyiv, and they'll be reporting back. And from that, there will be liaison staff with the Ukrainian military and different elements of the Ukrainian government picking up and talking to people about what is happening on the ground, because it's a two-way flow. It's identifying what Ukraine is doing on the ground, but it's also been able to provide input from an intelligence perspective, a diplomatic perspective, and everything else to try and help the Ukrainians in their interactions with the international community.
And that statement by Lloyd Austin, does it qualify as plausible deniability when he talks about, well, we're not in favor of hitting targets inside of Russia?
Well, I think if you listen to the UK Foreign Secretary, where he turned around and said that it would be legitimate to attack targets inside Russia which are being used to launch attacks against Ukraine, I think it gets into the complexity of the operation. Now, there's been an agreement not to use the very long-range weapons that have been provided by the UK, by France, and by other countries to attack into Russia itself. But we have seen these mysterious drone attacks going into various parts of Russia. There are clearly partisan units operating inside Russia from almost certainly Russian individuals who disagree with what is going on inside Ukraine. And we've got the Russian units that have gone and captured the area in Belgorod, which conveniently means that the Russians are having to take some of their reserve forces that they would be wanting to use to counter any Ukrainian counteroffensive and are having to move them up to deal with this. It's all part of a wider, much more complex operation. And I think it's giving us a masterclass in high intensity conflict, in a modern information driven environment, but at the bottom of it all is the real human piece and the horror that there is on the ground for the military and for the civilians that have had to come through it, and then that horror spread across the whole of Ukraine, where people on a nightly basis don't know whether something is going to come and attack them as they're sleeping.
Has the perception I don't know how many times you've been to Ukraine since the start of this conflict, Catherine, but is the perception of NATO changing, or is it the same as it was on day one?
I mean, every time there's the same refrain of basically give us more weapons and get them there faster. So there's an element of gratitude and there's an element of frustration. Just coming back on that point about this, obviously the information war angle of it, this is just hugely present in this war in the way that it hasn't been in any other conflict situation that I've covered, because, you know, we've been in the internet age before, but this is really the age of instant geolocalization and things like that. So the Ukrainians clearly very sensitive about that. And that's why they're asking everyone to be quiet, basically, and not talk about it. But it's interesting on the ground because you've got kind of this army of journalists going up and down the front lines trying to work out where, if ever, the counteroffensive will come, which areas, and, you know, their newsrooms wanting more information, and the Ukrainian military and press officers trying not to give out any information and trying to keep it down on the social networks. So it's a hugely complex, not only military operation, but informational operation as well. So there's going to be a lot of subterfuge and feints in there as well. We've got to be very careful with all the reports coming out of this.
I'm haunted by something Philip Ingram said at the start of the conversation. I want your reaction, Maria Zolkina, which is just how much information are you gleaning by looking at Russian Telegram channels, for instance?
Actually, not so much. Basically, partially, yes. So sometimes, of course, I'm interested in how they how they explain some impressions on decisions of either Ukrainian or Russian leadership, both political or military one. But basically, I would rather rely on some information which can be somehow actually checked and verified.
And Ina Sofson, let me ask you, right now we have the U.S. president who's meeting at the White House with the Danish Prime Minister. Later in the week, he'll be sitting down with the UK Prime Minister, Rishi Sunak. We talked about how 2024 could be very different, but for now, your thoughts on how NATO has performed, the NATO allies, are they rising to the occasion to the extent that you expected them to?
Well, we are extremely grateful to our partners. Without their help, standing against the what was believed to be the second strongest army in the world would not be possible, no matter how brave our soldiers are and how committed our civilians are. So we are grateful for everything that has been done, trust me. Unfortunately, we keep coming back, as a colleague in the studio said, keep on coming back asking for more, just because this intensity of the warfare is something that no total single army has been prepared for, included, of course, Ukrainian. So, of course, we need to do this because for us it's existential. And for us, asking for weapons and getting the weapons is something that allows us to continue living as an independent sovereign state. So we are so far grateful for what has been done by individual member states of NATO. NATO as itself, of course, has its internal problems, and there are countries inside NATO that can basically veto any big decisions by the bloc itself. However, it doesn't mean that Ukraine doesn't want to join NATO. And actually, the number of people who are willing to join NATO, who want Ukraine to join NATO, is growing every day, basically. It's now over 80% of Ukrainians who believe that we should join NATO, the number that has increased significantly compared to pre-February 24. And why is that so? Because that is the single long-term guarantee for our security. I have a 10-year-old son. In 8 years, he will be 18. He will be drafted into the army if the war were to continue or to restart again. And the only way to prevent that from happening, from our children to continue fighting in this war, is for us to have those long-term security guarantees. And NATO is the single guarantee that we can have. That is why we are asking for NATO countries to consider a clear road to membership for Ukraine as soon as possible, as soon as that is politically feasible. Because, look, again, from the very personal perspective, I don't want my son to continue fighting the war that his father is fighting in right now. That is something that we really want to prevent.
And we wish your son and your partner and all your loved ones safety in these very tenuous times. I want to thank you so much, Ina Sovsun, for being with us from Kyiv. I want to thank Maria Zalkina in Warsaw, Philip Ingram in London, Catherine Norris-Trent, your reporting, which you can see on our website, france24.com.